Hi, time for learning a little bit more about our Indian culture. And as you remember yesterday, I talked about the Indians and I said that they were here before, in America, before anyone else was here. They lived, as far as we know, they lived all over America, not just on the East Coast, but they lived absolutely everywhere. They lived in individual little towns that they called villages, or they called them tribes. And so there were many tribes. There were the Cheyennes, and there were the uh, Nez Perce out where we live. There were Indians that were maybe more violent, if that's the right word. There were Indians that were more peaceful. They didn't want any trouble. The Apaches, the Comanches. Um, anyway, the Chippewa, the Ojibwa. So Indians were all over this United States before the white man even got here. They lived in small tribes, and these Indians did not have a way to read or write. So, in order for a child to learn, they learned by example. They learned from parents. The parents showed them what to do. And the Indian moms were much into raising the family. They took care of kids. They picked the berries. They fixed the dinners. They sewed the clothes. They built, actually, were the builders of the houses. And the dads were protectors of the family, and they were the hunters and the fishers. They would go out and they would collect or gather things or get things, kill things that the family could eat, and they protected the family against any neighboring tribes that might want to cause some problems. Um, the children were taught by parents, but they weren't taught like you are taught. Much if your learning is from school, and their learning was not from books, because they had no reading way to read or way to write. The Indians were a black-haired, brown-eyed group of people. They wore their hair long because they had no real way of cutting their hair. They could cut it with a rock, perhaps, but they had no metal. That they had not been able to invent metal. That was a white man's invention. And so scissors were not made, knives were not made, not knives made of metal. They made bone knives, but so they all wore their hair long because it was easier to keep it long. And many times they would wear it in braids, whether you were a boy or whether you were a girl. You wore your hair in braids because it just kept it out of your face. Otherwise, it was kind of fly away, and So many times they wore a headband just to keep their hair out of their work when they were trying to work. So the Indians were a smooth people. In other words, they didn't have big beards and mustaches and hairy chests and all that. They were kind of a smooth people as far as looking at them. The Indians were they they were called a savage people because they had no real way of becoming educated, other than educating each other. And so many Indians were learned hard bad things because their parents had done bad things, and they learned bad things too. So warring was a big problem. They had war paint, and some Indians they would steal from neighbors and from other tribes and cause problems with the other tribal people. But they had there was no education in that. There's no education against that. They did not have the Word of God. They had nothing to soften them, nothing to convict their hearts that they were wrong. And so until the white man came, the Indians did not know that God loved them and that He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to die for their sins. And there was a way for them to have a personal relationship with God. And instead, they made up things, they made up ideas, they worshiped nature things, they worshiped the trees, the sun, the moon, the stars, the wind, the grass. They worshiped animals, they worshiped stuff, but they didn't worship the one true God. And God said, that is absolutely wrong. They were worshiping the creation instead of worshiping the Creator. The Indians were, they had each little village, each little tribe had their own leaders. And usually it was a chief, they called him a chief. And these leaders would wear very fancy headgear. And every time the chief did something that was brave, he would put a feather in his headgear. And sometimes the chief would have these very long, that would, drape clear behind them, a fancy headgear because he had done so many brave acts. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the boys becoming about 13 and changing from boyhood into manhood. And they did that by being out in a forest and staying out by themselves and fasting, and that means like not eating for a long period of time or eating very little while they're in the forest. And when they came back, they had a big celebration because now this child was no longer just a little boy. This child had turned into a man because he had proved that he was rough and rugged. The Indians didn't have names like we have. The Indians had names that were meaningful names. Not saying that yours is not a meaningful name. I don't mean to imply that. But the Indians were named things like Bitter Water, or Small Sunshine, or Little Star, or Little Fox, or Great Wolf. And they had these names that kind of had a significant meaning in their life. The Indians ate things that God had provided. Yes, they ate meat, much meat, deer, elk, any number of fish, moose, anything that they could capture like that. But they also picked things to eat. They picked a multitude of berries. There were certain kind of vegetables. No, not vegetables, but like roots, I guess you would call them, roots and things like that, bulbs, pieces of bark off trees that they could make a drink from. So they were always looking for something to eat. They didn't usually grow gardens. Every once in a while, yes, but that wasn't their usual custom. They usually went out and gathered things. And one of the things that they did plant and that many Indians ate was called maize, M-A-I-Z-E, maize. And what it is corn. And they grew a kind of corn. Now, the corn they grew was only about as big as your thumb. It wasn't very big at all. But they grew this corn, and sometimes they would dry it and make it into a flour, or sometimes they would just eat it like it is. Sometimes they would pickle it using some kind of fermented something or other and make it so it's kind of like, today we would call it hominy, but they would use their corn like that. And sometimes they had a corn that was actually would pop, like popcorn that we know. But they didn't eat it like we eat it. They eat the popcorn kind of like with water on it or with some kind of something on it. More like breakfast cereal, if you would. All right. The Indians love to tell legends. And a legend is like a story. It's like a story that maybe Grandpa would tell to your dad, and then the dad would tell to you, and you would tell to your son or your daughter when you got to be big. And then the story would carry on and on and on. And so they would sit around the fire at night, the campfires at night, and they love to tell stories like, oh, Daddy, tell me, like when you were a little kid. And maybe you probably say that to your dad all the time. Hey, Dad, tell me that story because that was a really cool story. Or tell me, Daddy, that funny story about what Grandpa did when he was little. Okay, so these were stories that they told. And sometimes they... maybe they made up stories. It wasn't like a real happening. It was kind of like the three Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and that story didn't ever happen. Somebody just made it up, and people just kept continuing it. So some of their stories were like that. They just made up a story, and kids just like to hear it, and so dads and grandpas would sit at the fire and tell these stories over and over again. These tribes did not have a way of exchanging money, like buying from one person to the next. They did a lot of trading, but they didn't do a lot of trading between tribes. Each tribe was by itself, and they didn't get together and say, well, let's have a big, we'll exchange this and that. No, each tribe was specific to itself. And so they just lived. But if one person in the tribe had made, something extra, they would share it with someone else or trade with someone else. Someone had gathered more berries, found a really good berry patch, and the mom and the kids had picked a lot of berries. Maybe they would trade that for a piece of meat from one of the other Indians in that tribe. So, um, overall, the white man and the Indian, when the white man finally moved in, they did not see eye to eye in many, many cases. The Indian had lived here before the white man. The Indian knew what they needed. The Indian knew where things grew and how things grew, and they were very much into protecting what they needed. The white man was very much into, this is fun to kill an animal and leave it. This is fun to do whatever, and more of a waste, if you will. And the Indians did not like that. The Indians were not wasteful people because they needed it. The white man didn't need an elk or a deer. The white man brought cows with him and sheep and goats, and they had those kinds of animals to eat as well as the extra animals. But the Indians did not. The Indians did not have cattle. The Indians did not have horses. The Indians did not have sheep. They didn't have that resource. And so all they had was what was in the forest, what God had provided. And so the white man and the Indian were not friends. They came from different places, and it caused a lot of problems. The white man was all about, this is my land. They would own a piece of land and they would put a fence around it. And it just upset the Indians so much because the Indians said, why could this piece of land be yours? It belongs to everybody. This land for all people. And do not put a fence around it. Because if you put a fence around it, I can't get through the fence to get to my animal that I need to shoot for my family. And so the Indians would cut down the fences or break down the fences, which made the white man mad. And the white man would build up the fences, and the Indians would say, no, would you stop doing that? And they would tear down the fences, and it would go on and on and on until, there was a problem and somebody would hurt somebody or somebody would kill somebody over a fencing issue. So it was an unusual situation when the white man moved into America because the Indians knew right from the very first that they were losing their land. They didn't lose it all at once, but they lost it a little bit at a time until the Indians had lost out all completely. And the white man, I think, sometimes felt badly for the Indians, and so they gave them some property. They called it reservations, and the Indians could live on the reservation free. Now, their housing wasn't free, but they didn't have to pay land taxes, and they gave them extra benefits when it comes to hunting and fishing. And there were some benefits, perhaps, to being an Indian, because the white men did kind of feel the responsibility of, because they had taken away the Indians' hunting land. They'd taken away the Indians' property, so to speak. So it was a hard situation between the white man and the Indian. All right. So that's all you need to know for this time around. We'll talk about them again. Bye-bye.